Hi, everyone. So I think we're going to start the webinar right now. I just want to thank everyone for making the time to come tonight. People are going to be rolling in, and that's okay, but I did want to start with some housekeeping. So thank you all for joining us again during October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. My name is Josephine Tang, and I use she and her pronouns. I am the program manager of the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Program at Newton-Wellesley Hospital. I also want to thank our amazing domestic and sexual abuse council members, the community benefits team, the senior leadership team, and development team at Newton-Wellesley Hospital for organizing these virtual offerings. Special thanks to the Second Step for presenting tonight and our wonderful crew of panelists from the Journey to Safety, and which is part of the Jewish Family and Children's Service of Waltham, the Boston Area Crisis Center, Reach Beyond Domestic Violence, and the One Love Foundation of Boston. Before we start, we just want to acknowledge that no one is immune to violence or abuse. Interpersonal violence is highly prevalent throughout all of our communities. And in the next hour, we'll be discussing topics that might feel uncomfortable or might be triggering for folks who have experienced interpersonal harm in the past, or are maybe currently struggling or in community with someone who has or is being impacted by violence and abuse. With that said, we encourage everyone to be gentle with themselves and to please take care of themselves as needed during this webinar. If you do find yourself needing support tonight, please see the chat as we have listed a number of local hotlines that are free, voluntary, and confidential for folks to call for support. We will also be sending out resources and contact information of all our panelists and speakers tonight after the webinar. You'll likely find that in your inbox tomorrow. We ask that folks feel free to engage in the chat, but if you do have questions for the speakers and panelists, if you look at your Zoom interface, please feel free to drop that in the Q&A rather than the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to private message me and I'm happy to follow up with you folks. And also, just for privacy and confidentiality reasons, we encourage folks to be mindful of posting any identifying information in the chat. But again, if you have questions, feel free to private message me. I will now pass it to Sarah Perry, our amazing Domestic and Sexual Abuse Council Chair, and today's moderator, who will be introducing our presenters and panelists. Sarah served for 4 years as the executive director of the Second Step in Newton. Prior to leading the Second Step, Sarah was the executive director at Harvard Business School's Community Action Partners, which provides pro bono performance improvement services to Boston area nonprofits. Sarah has spoken extensively about domestic violence and nonprofit effectiveness as a lecturer and panelist, and has published articles in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Newton Tab on the issues of domestic abuse and prevention. She is currently the community chair of the Newton-Wellesley Hospital Domestic and Sexual Abuse Council. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Joe, for all your outstanding work. And I also wanted to give a big thank you and shout out to Newton-Wellesley Hospital and specifically the collaborative that is sponsoring tonight's program. Welcome, everyone. We're really delighted to have such a great attendance tonight and to have such an incredible group of speakers and panelists. Let me now introduce the keynote speakers and the panelists as well. And I also just want to reiterate quickly what Joe said, which is that we'll be taking questions after the panel. So if you have questions either for a specific panelist or for all of them in general, please do submit them in the Q&A feature and we'll have time at the end to answer them. Lauren Brumfield, she/they, is a licensed certified social worker and serves as a community domestic violence advocate with the Second Step. Gabriella Wells, she/her, is also a licensed clinical social worker and a senior domestic violence advocate at the Second Step. She's worked with survivors in a variety of settings for over 4 years and is passionate about holistic programming to better support survivors. Lauren Knackel, she/her, has worked at Reach Beyond Domestic Violence in Waltham for the past 9 years in a variety of roles, including prevention and direct services. Dr. Jeff Lemberg, he/him, is a director in the Boston offices of One Love Foundation, a national nonprofit education organization that works to end relationship violence by teaching young people how to identify the signs of healthy and unhealthy relationship behaviors. He holds a PhD in public communication from the University of Maryland and is a longtime educator who specializes in media literacy education. Patrick Donovan, he, him, has nearly 20 years of experience working with adults, youth, communities, and communities to prevent and address sexual violence and intimate partner violence. At the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, he trains survivors. He provides trainings on survivor support and bystander intervention, and he works on community collaborations to prevent sexual violence. Julie Udovin, she, her, is the Outreach and Program Coordinator at Jewish Family and Children's Services Journey to Safety Program and has been with the organization since 2007. So without further ado, I wanted to hand it over for our keynote presentation with Lauren Brumfield and Gabby Wells of the Second Step. And thank you so much, Lauren and Gabby, and we're really looking forward to your talk. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully there's no issue. Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. And so we are going to be talking about recognizing unhealthy relationships and finding support. I am the Senior Community Advocate at the Second Step, and Lauren is presenting with me as well.
Yes, and I'm also an advocate at the Second Step. And thank you everyone so much for being here tonight.
Yeah. So just to start off, we want to kind of just give a brief overview of what abuse is, what domestic violence looks like. So a general definition is it's a pattern of behavior that one person uses to gain, maintain power and control over another person. It's really broad and kind of purposefully. There's a lot of misconception of what abuse looks like, often that it's only physical, and we still kind of abide by that in a lot of policy and a lot of social understanding of abuse. So it's kept general because we want to understand it in a grand scheme of things. So that kind of brings me to my next point of the types of abuse. So these are, and there's many different variations within this, but just to start, physical, like I said, that's probably the most commonly understood. But there's also emotional, verbal, and psychological abuse. We usually combine these because there's a lot of overlapping red flags or behaviors within these. So this looks like belittling, insulting someone, manipulating, or gaslighting. There's also sexual abuse, which in turn goes with physical. Financial abuse, which is very common and probably one of the most misunderstood and not spoken about forms of abuse. Cultural and spiritual, which really focus around someone's cultural identity. This may look like an abuser not allowing someone to go to their place of worship or practice their own cultural practices. Another one, which is more new age, and we're still learning how to safety plan accordingly with it, is digital and technological abuse. This looks like a lot of monitoring online, hacking, changing of passwords, or pretending to be someone online, their partner. And the last one is identity abuse. This is commonly seen within the LGBTQ community. And it could be, abusing someone based on their gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. So this is just a brief overview of what those forms of abuse may look like in a few examples. Now, just kind of understanding what abuse looks like, what this pattern of behavior looks like. It used to kind of be understood as a cycle of abuse, but we've changed that to now be called the wave of abuse. And it's because a cycle, it didn't always represent that. It wasn't always this perfect circle of going back around. A wave is better to kind of explain the way that the behavior goes. So to begin, it's a honeymoon stage. A lot of people think that, abusers come in and they're these aggressive, people, but the reality is that if people showed their abusive tendencies from the get-go, most people wouldn't get in relationships with them. It often starts with a honeymoon phase. This looks like love bombing or showering someone with immense affection, admiration in a really short period of time. The key is that it's very fast and intense very quickly and early on. And, there might be this gut feeling in the survivor, but, if they've ever experienced something like someone showering them presence and adoration, they might think this is amazing. This is what love is meant to be. So this is this honeymoon phase. And gradually tensions start to build. There's arguments, there's maybe monitoring. Maybe you go to a friend's house and someone's texting you saying, who's there? Who are you with? I just want to make sure you're safe. And it comes across as this concerned, caring kind of behavior, but it starts to get more and more intense. All of a sudden, the people that are there, they're not okay with them being there. You come home and there's arguments to be had of where you were. This begins to increase and increase, where you might find yourself refraining from telling who you're with or canceling plans so you can avoid conflict. You're starting to change behavior and how you present, kind of walking on eggshells is what it's commonly called. And there's an incident. This looks like the abusive incident. This could look physical, emotional, verbal, any of those forms that we had previously discussed. And this is a large incident where usually the survivor feels very afraid and threatened, and the abuser is taking control and inserting their power over them. After this is the apology, the hearts and flowers. I'm so sorry. A lot of excuses, a lot of deflecting. I'll never do that again. I was drunk, those kinds of things, really deflecting responsibility of what just happened. And then you go back, and the same old stuff is kind of a broad generalization, because the reality is that now there's a new set of rules. You're not necessarily going back to this honeymoon phase. You're going to now a new baseline of new rules, new expectations. You learned, okay, I can't go to my friend's house because they're going to get mad. So now I just don't see my friends that often. That's the new baseline that you're operating at. And then it builds again. And then this is that kind of cycle that we often see, and it continues on from there. A lot of information, but I think this is a good picture that just helps people understand why it is so difficult to get out of these abusive relationships and even recognize it's happening, because it's not black and white. It's very complex and it's up and down. And now I'm going to pass it on to Lauren.
Thank you. So kind of considering who was impacted by domestic violence, if there's one point that we really want to get across today, it's that domestic violence can unfortunately impact everyone, regardless of their identities. So regardless of gender, sexuality, race, size, ability, age, and more. As Gabby kind of touched on before, there are these stereotypes in society about maybe what an abuser looks like, what a survivor looks like. And I hope that some of these statistics can kind of show that this is an issue that touches everyone. I'm not going to go through and read every one of these. You can read them to yourselves, but one that I really want to highlight at the bottom is that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men experience domestic violence in their lifetimes. And this number is the same or higher for gender diverse individuals. I think a lot of times we hear folks say, I believe that domestic violence happens. I know that it's a problem, but it just doesn't happen here. It doesn't happen to anyone I know. It doesn't happen in my neighborhood, my community. And unfortunately, it probably is. You probably do know someone who's been impacted by this issue if it's 1 in 4 and 1 in 7. And to really kind of highlight that, I want to share a statistic about our community in Massachusetts that isn't on this slide. So last year, in the year of 2021, there were 15 domestic violence homicides in the state of Massachusetts. So it is happening to our neighbors in our community. That's not 15 people who are experiencing domestic violence generally statewide. That's people who lost their lives in 1 year alone. So now I'm going to share some myths and facts. As Gabby mentioned earlier, there is this common misperception, even amongst most of the survivors that we serve, that domestic violence is only physical. We really typically hear this from survivors who think that maybe their experiences aren't valid, they aren't actually experiencing domestic violence, or maybe they think that they don't deserve help or qualify for our services because their abuse is not physical. In reality, there are many other types of abuse besides physical abuse that Gabby shared earlier. And these forms can not only be more common, like psychological and verbal, but they can actually have really long-lasting impacts. We often hear survivors say, my physical injuries healed, but those psychological and verbal things that were said to me have stuck with me for years. Our next myth is that only women experience domestic violence and only men are abusers. Again, although statistically it is true that women experience domestic violence at higher rates than men, 1 in 7 men also experience domestic violence. And it is likely that the statistic is actually very underreported due to societal expectations and beliefs about gender, right? If you're hearing that men can't be abused and that's not possible, it's going to make it a lot harder to come forward and say, you know, I am being abused and I do need help. There's also a lack of appropriate resources for male survivors, which makes it even harder to come forward. So it is unfortunately estimated that that 1 in 7 statistic for men is even much higher. Our next myth is that if a survivor chooses to stay in the relationship, the abuse must not be that bad. This is far from the truth. Leaving has actually been shown to be the most dangerous time for survivors, high rates of violence. And there's many reasons why people might not leave these relationships, one being fear of the unknown. Maybe they've been with the abuser for a long time and they don't know what it'll be like when that relationship ends. They might have a lack of resources if they leave. Often survivors are cut off financially and socially. They might have threats of harm from their abuser, either to the survivor or children or pets. So it can be very challenging to leave these relationships, and that doesn't say anything about the severity of the situation. Our next myth is that domestic violence is an anger control issue. This is not true. Our fact is that abusers act deliberately and with forethought, and they are in control of their actions. A good example of this is that abusers do not treat their boss the same way as they treat their partner. Folks who are perpetrating domestic violence are very much in control of their actions. They can choose who they lash out to, and anger is a tool that they're using to get what they want or come up with an excuse. And our last myth is that children aren't aware of the violence going on in their homes. And this one can be really hard for people to come to terms with, especially survivors. No one wants to, face the fact that their children are experiencing pain or traumatic events. But when it comes down to it, studies do show that most children are aware of the violence in their homes. And it's really important to address this violence with them in an age-appropriate way, but in a way where they don't feel like they are being invalidated, or maybe that it's being brushed under the rug or people are pretending that it's not happening. Addressing it with them in a straightforward way and helping them get the care that they need is much more beneficial and long-term for children. So moving on to our next slide, we're often asked what warning signs might be for either people's own relationships or in the community. How can I notice that this is happening around me? So some of these signs might be ones that you would notice in your own relationship, and some of these are going to be geared more towards warning signs you might be able to pick up in others. Starting with our first one, it's extreme jealousy and possessiveness. So this might look like jealousy of past relationships, or time spent away from the partner with friends or family, or this fear that the partner will meet someone else at work or school or an environment where the abuser is not present, or accusations of cheating or an affair. Our second warning sign is increased social isolation. So this can look like trying to cut the partner off from family or friends, or limiting time spent with those folks without the abuser also present. Accusations about family and friends causing trouble or interfering with the relationship. And it can also look like a survivor becoming more reserved or distant socially. Our third warning sign is frequent, unexplained, or underexplained injuries. So this might look like, it's pretty self-explanatory, a survivor presenting with more frequent injuries than they did before getting into this relationship, or injuries that are kind of more severe or inconsistent with their explanation. Maybe someone has full body bruising and you ask what happens and they say that they tripped on the curb, and that sounds a little suspicious. Our fourth warning sign is frequent excuses for the partner's actions. So this could look like the survivor constantly needing to justify their partner's actions. This might look like they only hit me once, they won't do it again. They yell at me because their job is stressful, or kind of related to our fifth warning sign, the survivor might think that they deserve what happens to them. So, oh, well, I was being annoying, so I deserve that abuse. And that could also be an excuse. That leads us into our fifth, decreased self-esteem. The survivor might become increasingly and unnecessarily apologetic, make more negative statements about themselves, or believe that they deserve what happens to them. And again, that can be in the context of the abusive relationship, but also in general. Maybe they, they're in a parking lot and someone bumps into their car. They might spiral and think, I deserve this. I'm a bad driver. It's all my fault. I'm such a screw up, even though that's kind of not a warranted reaction in that situation where someone else is hitting your car, right? But it's just that pattern, that mindset that survivors get into. And our final warning sign that's on this slide, I'd say this is probably the most overarching one that's on this slide, or the most common one that we see, is controlling behaviors. So that can look like basically anything that limits the survivor's own decision-making capacity. The abuser might be controlling aspects of the survivor's appearance, socialization, decision-making. That could be about their education, their work, their use of technology. And this is often disguised as care or concern for the survivor. I think Gabby gave a good example of that earlier. Like, I just am checking in because I love you and I care about you and I want you to do well. And there's a couple other common ones. Obviously, there's many warning signs within relationships and that you might notice in others. It's hard to fit them all into one slide, but there's a couple more common ones to look out for that I just want to highlight, including cruelty to animals, destroying or disrespecting the survivor's belongings, and unrealistic expectations for the partner's behavior, such as expecting them to be perfect or meet every need or be their entire world. So I'm going to pass it back on to Gabriella.
Thank you. So now kind of switching gears, and Lauren did a good transition of that we've talked a lot about just framing what domestic violence looks like, especially for the survivor experiencing it. This is now more so for people that want to support those in their life about, that may be experiencing domestic violence. And there are do's and don'ts. There's good ways to support and not great ways to support. So we're just going to briefly go over some of those. So some do's are checking in at a safe time and place. It's important to note that not any time is the right time to check in with someone if they're experiencing violence. You don't know if there's monitoring going on, if someone's checking their calls or their text messages. So be just mindful about when you're checking in. Also, take time to listen and believe what they say. You're not a police officer, you're not a judge. You're there as a support system, as a friend or a family member who's just concerned, and you're just there to give them space and speak. Of course, express concern for their well-being. This goes hand in hand, like I said before. Offer helpful resources. We're not saying you can't offer anything and you just sit there, but be mindful of the resources you're giving. If someone's telling you something traumatic or that they're experiencing, you don't have to say, call 911 right now. If they're not ready for that, you can say, oh, I went to this webinar and I learned about this and they shared these resources. Maybe this could be helpful. That's a more gentle way of sharing that, just saying, I'm thinking of you and I think this would help, rather than placing an expectation. Also, respect their choices. The hardest thing about domestic violence is that we cannot control other people's decisions. And the more we try to do that, the more we're going to push them away. And then they won't feel comfortable opening up for help. So we do have to respect their choices. They might not make the decisions we think they should, but that's not our job. Remind them that it isn't their fault. This sounds pretty common sense, but the reality is that they may not have heard that ever. You might be the first person that is saying to them, you didn't deserve this. You didn't do anything wrong. Because like Lauren had said, usually abusers operate in blaming, and survivors think that they have done something wrong or they deserve it, or they need to change something about themselves and it'll get better. But you just saying this isn't your fault, you didn't do anything wrong, can be really groundbreaking for survivors. And be patient. Like I said, there isn't a time frame on this. Unfortunately, as much as we want to help people and get them out of ASAP, we have to be patient. And it's not just one factor, it's 1,000. And a lot of those have to line up. And then some don'ts. These ones are big. So everybody wants to help, and it doesn't always come across in a helpful way. So don't feel the need to be an expert. That is why we exist. These agencies exist to support survivors, and we're professionally trained with years of experience. So it's okay to lean on us. It's okay to say, I don't know all the answers, but these people do. You should reach out to them. That's super helpful. Obviously, don't judge and blame them. They're already feeling that internally. Trust me, that's the shame that they feel and keeps them pretty frozen. So you projecting that on them is not going to help. Don't set ultimatums. Again, it's the time frame. You know, they have to make those decisions on their own, and this can put a lot of pressure on people and just makes them kind of freeze and feel like they can't do anything. Pressuring them to make decisions, similarly. You don't have to provide counseling or advice. Like I said, there's professionals there. You don't have to be their therapist, be their friend, be their, you know, sister, brother, parent, whoever you are. You don't have to be a professional role. And lastly, and probably the most important, don't mediate between survivors and abusers. This is super unsafe for all parties. You know, you don't know the situation. It can just cause a lot of unsafe communication. And also then you kind of have now told the abuser that the survivor has spoken to you about what's going on. And that can cause a really unsafe situation. And second to this, because that was a lot of information, these are just the key messages. Like, it doesn't even have to be that complex. It's as simple as this, as just saying these things to survivors. If someone's coming to you and you're just like, I don't know what advice to give, I don't know what to say, this is all you have to say. I believe you. It's not your fault. You're not alone. I'm here for you. Help is available. Thank you for telling me. These are groundbreaking things to say to survivors, because usually they have not heard these ever or in a very long time. So it can be as simple as this. You're just offering them the space. Thank you, and I will share this. Now send it to Lauren.
Thank you. Yeah, and as Gabby just shared, you know, you're not alone. There are many organizations, some of which are represented here tonight in the area, that this is, you know, all we do all week, all year. So, you know, a list of those is going to go out with more details. So like the names of organizations locally, how to get in touch with them, all of that is going to be sent to folks who signed up for this webinar via email by the end of this week. But this is kind of generally what you could expect if you get in touch with those organizations. So these are just examples of services that we provide. Not every organization has every one of these services, but we are all pretty linked in with each other. So if you do call one of our organizations and we don't have, say you're looking for emergency shelter, and that's not something that our organization offers, we're happy to help refer you to one that does have that. So just reviewing what's generally offered, we have safety planning, support groups, advocacy, limited financial assistance in some cases, emergency and transitional shelter, referrals. That's not just to other domestic and sexual violence organizations in the area. That can also be to many different types of resources, legal help, and counseling. But in the center, we have support. As Gabby said, you're not alone in this, whether you personally are experiencing domestic violence, or if you just want to call someone to check in. Maybe you're concerned about someone that you know and you want to talk to someone more about those warning signs you're noticing. That is what we're here for. So again, additional resources and contact information for these organizations will be shared with you all. Some are shared in the chat right now, and the rest will be shared via email. But if it is an emergency, always call 911 first. Most of these are not going to be able to respond as quickly as emergency responders would, but we are here to support surrounding domestic violence. So yeah, that is the end of our presentation. We really appreciate you all being here. And I think now we're going to switch over to our panel.
Yes, thank you so much, Lauren and Gabby. That was a really excellent presentation, very informative. And I know that there's some terrific questions and very in the chat. So I want to just go to them. I'll take them in order in which I got them. And anyone on the panel who wants to answer them, feel free. They're not directed at any one particular individual who's on the panel. The first question is as follows. I've been made aware of a possible likely abusive relationship in my congregation. The person who's writing is a local pastor, but the wife who is the victim has not shared this information directly with me. Though I've not witnessed the behavior I experience the wife to be very careful and exhibiting hypervigilant behavior when he is around. Do you have any recommendations for how to come alongside of her or create an opportunity, open a dialogue to have a conversation with her? So much of the things that were in the presentation, which are terrific, were around like when you already know and how to support someone who you already know is an abusive relationship. But how do you open that conversation? Can someone answer that? Who's on the panel, please?
I can get us started.
Great.
If that's okay. So thank you so much. That's an amazing question to start with. And I know when our organization we do get calls from clergy asking that question and similar questions, and we're so grateful when clergy are tuned in and notice things. So thank you also just for thinking about what your role is here. I would say, when we always start with safety, right? So making sure that if you're able to talk to somebody by themselves, that, it wasn't that other people didn't witness you coming up and saying, hey, can I talk to you? So that you don't create a situation where the abusive husband might later come back at that person and say, so why did the reverend or the rabbi or the, whoever want to talk to you? What was that all about? So the first thing is to try to do it as discreetly as possible, which I imagine you're already thinking of, because that's part of the business of clergy is that discretion. And I think it's okay, and other folks may have different perspectives, but I think if you are able to talk to somebody alone in private with the door closed, to just kind of note what you've noticed and say, if there's anything that you want to talk about, it doesn't have to be right now. I just want you to know that I'm here for you. And so not to feel like you have to force a conversation, especially if you've worked really hard to get privacy and things like that, not to feel like this is my one shot, I got to get it all in, but rather to just create that open space. It's like opening a door and saying, if there's anything here and to say, I understand that abuse is really about control, as Gabby and Lauren just explained beautifully, that it's really about controlling behavior. And here's some things that I've noticed, and I just want to check in with you and see how you're doing. Leave it very open-ended. And it could be a conversation for right there. It could be a conversation for another time. And I would also suggest having resources ready. So if the person does start to talk, to have the phone numbers and the contact information that you are going to get soon in the next couple of days ready and with you, so that if that person wants that information, you have it for them. And I would also say in that moment to check and see if you can safely give it to them, right? Because as you just heard from Gabby and Lauren, quite often abusive individuals will go through their partner's phones and purses and pockets and things like that. So it may not be safe for you to hand somebody a phone number, but you could tell them. And the other thing that you could do, we encourage faith communities especially to do this, is to say, if you want to make a private phone call, that's not on your cell phone, that can't be traced, you can do it here. We'll get you a private space here in the house of worship or somewhere that your partner won't be able to track that phone log, won't know that you made the call. You're welcome to come here and use a computer if you want to do an online chat to get help, or if you want to do some research. Think of ways you could use your space as a safe space for that person also. If they want to meet with an advocate, a house of worship might in some cases be a safe space, not always, but might be. So I think things like that, thinking both about opening windows and doors and things like that, but also very practically, what might this person need? It's fine to say, how can I support you and what do you need? And then how do you make those things available to them? And the last thing I'll say before sending it on, I think everybody here has done a lot of faith work, but I know Lauren Knackel especially has thought a lot about working with faith communities to really, think about maintaining that privacy and how that person might be able to get in touch with you and making sure that they have all that information. So I will stop there and pass it to whoever.
I would love to add a couple of things on if that's okay.
Lauren, please do. Thank you. Thanks.
It's so hard to go after Julie and yet so easy, because she makes things feel so clear and so accessible in so many ways. I think the one thing that I might add to it is for clergy people, but also friends and family in general, to know that our programs are here for you as well. So if you are preparing to have a conversation with this particular person, and you're trying to think through, how do I approach this conversation? What do I say in these moments? You could call one of our organizations and we can do a practice run with you. We can give you feedback on different ways that you can phrase questions to make it accessible. And you can also talk with us about what would it look like if someone were to call your program and want to work with you. And that can be really helpful twofold. One, it can give you some confidence. There's sometimes some distrust, some history between faith-based organizations and domestic violence organizations, thinking that we're not working along the same mission. I think the reality is that we often are, and we're often siloed in unnecessary ways. So if you can talk with that person and have a conversation, exactly how Julie was describing, and add on, you know, I've spoken with these people. I know people who are there. I've attended a webinar such as this, and demystify it a little, that can make it more accessible for that person. It might make it more likely that she might reach out to us.
Really great. Thank you. Thank you both so much for your really helpful answers. I want to get to another question, which is in the Q&A. This person writes, as a sibling, when does it become our job to make sure our sibling is safe? It's so difficult to sit by and watch. Long-time abusive relationship, 20 years, verbal, psychological, financial, kids involved, law enforcement profession. Do we just continue to support, offer resources, etc.? I've done this for a really long time. And then they added a little more context saying that the abuser has convinced this person that they can't make it on their own, they'll be destitute, etc. And this person believes it. We've had really frank conversations, so it's out in the open. Just don't know how to get this person to take the next step to get out of this marriage. Who would like to address that? That's also a really great question. You know, when you've been supporting someone for 20 years in a long-term abusive relationship, and you're just really concerned, what are the next steps you can take? What should be done? Who would like to answer that one for us? Anyone, feel free to just jump in.
I'm happy to take a little bit. I know I'm not a panelist, but
thanks, Gabby.
I think one of the biggest things, and I had kind of spoken about this, and it's not a very satisfying answer, is that, you know, taking away the expectation that this person will leave this marriage, that's the goal, I think also helps feel more supportive. Because if that's the goal, it's always going to feel like it's not being met, you know, there's more that you could do. But if you're framing it more that this is someone that you care for, that you just want to have the most safety, support, you know, love in their life possible, you're able to do that. You're able to show them that. And the more that you surround survivors with respect, you know, allowing them to have boundaries, allowing them to have choice in their life, that empowers them to then realize and recognize that what they're currently in is not that. So you want to exemplify that. And while it's really frustrating, I hear you, because to sit and say, you know, what if this person doesn't leave this marriage that they've been in for 20 years and that's their life, feels heartbreaking, especially when it's a loved one. But saying, you know, I'm going to stand by this person because I love them. And if I'm going to be one of the few people in their life that can show them safety and love, at least they have that. And I think that can feel a lot more helpful in a situation when the reality is we can't force them to leave, right? Unless like law enforcement and things like that, but still we can't force people to do things. But yeah, and I want to pass it on because I don't want to talk for too long, but if anyone else wants to add.
No, that's great, Gabby. Thank you. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
Gabby, that was beautiful.
Yeah.
I would, you know, also add my just allow yourself to step back also. It is okay to take a break from supporting somebody. I know it can be really hard to give yourself permission to just say, I can't talk about this today, but I would encourage you when you need to give yourself that space to just say, I can't right now. I can again, and I'll be able to talk about this again, but I need to breathe and take care of myself. So I just want to encourage you to take care of yourself in all of that. And also just to keep in mind that what's coming into the person who's experiencing abuse, what's coming in hard most of the time from an abusive person is that they're stupid and they're awful and they're terrible and all of these things. And, you know, like Gabby said, you are that counterbalance. You may be one of the only voices. And so that strength, just going back to pointing out what the person is doing well and pointing out, you know, what makes them amazing or awesome, or why you love them, and what they're good at, and what they're, you know, we have conversations with people who will talk for 20 or 30 minutes and tell us about what they're surviving and what's going on. And at the end they say, oh my God, I can't believe I'm such a mess. I'm so sorry. And then what we do is reflect back to them what we're hearing, which is, look at your amazing strength. Look at, you got up this morning and put your shoes on and got out the door. If you didn't get out the door, you did this other thing, or you made this call today. And just to kind of turn that narrative as often as you can, turn that narrative of all that bad stuff into like the strength that it takes to survive that, the strength that it takes to move through that, as kind of your I don't know, your there's some scientific word, your proof that this person is not awful and worthless and useless and all those things that the abusive person is saying. You know, you're holding up the mirror of what you see, and that's really important. And like Abby said, getting them to leave isn't the goal, but helping them feel stronger, helping them feel more secure in their own skin is a good place to work toward.
Great. Thanks so much, Julie. That's great. I'm going to go on to another question because we have a lot and I want to make sure we get to all of them. The next question, and I'm not reading it, I'm not sure if I'm reading 100% correctly, but it says, what can we do when you are witnessing domestic violence with a family member, but the person too is getting harmed, you're not seeing any violence, essentially is what it's asking. Also, how do you interfere when children are witnessing the violence as well? Does anyone want to take that one on?
Yeah, I'll address it. At least from the children's standpoint, you know, I would say, you know, we know that there is a cycle of violence, right? And so quite often education is, you know, one of the best tools to break that cycle. And so opportunities to provide age-appropriate, age-appropriate learning materials to the young people to help them make sense of what's going on, to find the language to what's going on. That's something my organization, One Love Foundation, does, where we work specifically with young people. And there's a number of organizations, including those here, that engage with young people in that way. And so I do think there's opportunities to kind of separately, you know, get in front of the kids and be able to help them kind of process what's happening, because it is obviously for them just incredibly complicated. If they're in physical danger, then of course I think, you know, law enforcement needs to be involved. The previous question, or the first part of the question, you know, is if you're not seeing the physical abuse. You know, we always say that, you know, physical abuse is not the defining factor of an unhealthy relationship. You know, we know that emotional abuse in a relationship doesn't always lead to physical abuse, but we also know that in relationships that are physically abusive, emotional abuse is almost always precedes it. And so this idea that not having to see the physical abuse doesn't mean that there aren't warning flags and warning signs that need to be engaged upon by, you know, talking with that person. So I guess I would just say, you know, emotional abuse is something that should be taken as seriously as physical in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for all of that, Jeff. Really appreciate it. Does anyone want to add anything to that answer? Okay, great. There was a question that was not in the Q&A, but I saw it in the chat. Someone said they are a social worker in obstetrics at Brigham Women's Hospital and have been having trouble in connecting with SafeLink, finding open beds for survivors, even other surrounding states. Yeah, we know this is a big problem. Everyone's nodding. Any suggestions as to how to best assist patients with this? It's a great question and something that all of us who have worked in this sector for a long time have struggled with. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to add or any suggestions about that?
I can start. I'm sure other folks may have other thoughts. So at Reach, we do operate an emergency shelter, and we are one of those programs who is on the other end of the phone, constantly having our beds be full. The reality is that we have a severe shortage of domestic violence shelter beds here in Massachusetts. There's about 162 beds for the entire Commonwealth, which is not sufficient for the number of calls that we're getting. And we're having to, unfortunately, turn people away each and every day. Systemically, and I know this doesn't answer the person's question, but systemically, the best way that we could access and provide more shelter to survivors is by addressing the housing crisis. because people are having to stay in our shelters for longer and longer periods of time because they're not able to find that safe next step. So choosing between staying in shelter or potentially going back to the abuser, we're going to continue walking that journey. And there's fantastic programs like the Second Step that operates a transitional living program. Many of the survivors who first come into reach eventually go to the Second Step, and we work collaboratively in those ways. For right now, until we can solve that housing crisis, the best thing you can do is keep calling if shelter is necessary, and safety planning with the patients if shelter is not going to be available. Sometimes there's a not ideal, but other option that they can go to in the short term. It might be staying with friends or family. It might be staying in the hospital an extra night if that's something that your team might be able to do. It might be connecting with a faith community and someone who they're connected to, a friend of a friend. There's obviously risks in lots of different areas, and each situation is so different that it's really hard to figure out one be all catch all. And I think all the profound nodding that you're seeing on the screen is we have each and every one of us face this challenge, and our heart is with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a real problem. And as Lauren said, and lots of structural issues there. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with everything Lauren just said. There's a huge shortage of housing. I think on that ground level, because obviously the longer term solution will have to be policy, as Lauren said. Something I found to be helpful is just casting a wide net, especially knowing how limited beds are in general, but especially domestic violence. If someone has multiple things going on, as people in these situations often do, if someone is using substances, if someone has a disability, if there's anything that you think can move people up those wait lists, if there's any other organizations outside of domestic violence that you think you might be able to connect with, I would just connect with them if you could get permission from the survivor to, you don't even have to share details, just saying, I'm wondering if there's any other organizations that also specialize in housing. I've sometimes had luck with that. Maybe I'm calling all the domestic violence shelters and no one has any beds, but someone has this other thing going on where there's a social worker in that area who just had a bed open up. So I really say everything Lauren said, and cast a wide net, see if there's any other area. Maybe the child that survivor has a social worker. So just seeing who else might specialize in housing that's kind of out of the box, doing some creative thinking there, because we can't magically make there be more beds, unfortunately. I wish we could.
Yeah, and I think I love that the Laurens are talking about options. I think you at the hospital, you're in this really great and unique position of shifting a conversation from there's a shelter bed or there's not, you can leave or you can stay, to what kind of other supportive services can you connect people with in the meantime while they're waiting for a bed to open up? Can you connect them with the DV program that's going to give them ongoing support, or as Lauren B said, other kinds of supportive services that they might need, but breaking the isolation that they may be experiencing is huge. So even if you can't get them into a safe space where they can sleep, if there's any way that they can have contact with somebody who can give them some ongoing support, you're in a position there to do that. In some cases, we understand not always. So I think just shifting the conversation from I can leave or I'm stuck here and there's nothing in between, shifting that conversation to where are your options, where are your supports, you're doing a huge service if you can do that.
Thanks, Joy, that's great. Another question is around sexual violence and how to support someone who's been sexually abused. How do you support someone with some bystander intervention? How do you work on collaborations to support people who have experienced sexual violence, and how do you prevent it? I know, Patrick, that's totally your wheelhouse. So if you could field that one, I really appreciate it.
Sure. So I'll try in a time-effective way to talk about both the support aspects and the bystander and prevention aspects. For the support, a lot of what Lauren B. and Gabby talked about earlier is going to hold true with sexual violence. Safety is always going to be a consideration, but it's important that it not be the only consideration. So when we're reminding people of things like, this wasn't your fault, somebody else chose to do this to you, that empathy really helps people feel supported and helps people then continue telling someone else and seeking more support in the future. And similarly, in the presentation of how they talked about abuse being about power and control, that's why it's so important to let survivors make their own decisions, even, as they mentioned, if those decisions are slower than you'd like or not the same decisions that you'd like, and knowing that you don't have to be, as they said, a judge. You can just believe them. And unfortunately, sometimes the harder the story, the more trying that belief can be. But that belief is huge, and connecting them to resources is huge. On the prevention end, so in the moment, there's bystanders. So you can say something, you can cause a distraction, you can pull in a third party. But the longer term prevention begins looking at, what sort of gender socialization are we giving people? What sort of expectations are we teaching people around what sexual violence is, what consensual sex is, what is the role of equality and violence in solving problems? And so that's the sort of longer term work of this.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That's really helpful. And I really appreciate you mentioning the prevention aspect as well. And I know that's something Jeff works on a lot at One Love, is educating and engaging young people how to understand signs of unhealthy relationships in their digital lives. Jeff, could you say something a little bit about that? Because I think this prevention piece is really important. And I want to stay on in a minute, and I really appreciate you raising it, Patrick. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, we do prevention and intervention, kind of push-pull. Like the push is direct educational programming through schools, colleges, community-based organizations. We have these short narrative videos and films about specific relationship issues that are really highly produced that we do. They're not cringy because that wouldn't go over very well with kids, high school students, college students. And the pull is where, to your question, we use digital media quite often to engage people, young people, where they are. And so Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, dating apps. So we have a partnership with Hinge where we're providing educational content to Hinge, which is the dating app they want you to delete so you can find your one. And so it's very much in line with, healthy relationships. We do a fair amount also with just media literacy education. So helping young people understand have a more refined understanding of the media environment they occupy and kind of the way that we all curate the way we're seen online, and that includes our relationships. And so how to make sense of that, how to push back against that. And then digital spaces, we have 3 new PSAs that we just launched around digital abuse. And those are being put out through Twitch and ID Discovery and other places, really to kind of push people or pull people to our website, where we have tons and tons of information, tons of resources, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the short answer is the digital media ecosystem is so complex and vast, there is no short and easy answer. It needs to be authentic and speaking to people where they are and how they want it to reach them.
Great, thank you. I know also Reach in the Second Step and Journey to Safety also do prevention work. And if anyone wants to add anything, does anyone want to add anything to that, or should I go to the next question?
I would love to add, so I have worked in prevention for the past 7 years at Reach, and a lot of what we do is supporting the supporters. So thinking about not every survivor needs to call an organization like ours. If we can build both the confidence and the competence, especially, of friends and family and clergy and helping people in survivors' lives, that they can listen and believe and do some of that more basic supporting. It may be true that many survivors still need us, but for many, just having that believing and supportive other might be enough. So being able to have conversations, I think preventionists drink a lot of coffee and hang out in coffee shops and spend time with wonderful, wonderful people. One of the groups that I do just want to give a special shout out to is in partnership with one of our local community roundtables in Lincoln, Sudbury, and Wayland. There's a men's engagement group that's really focusing on exactly what Patrick was talking about earlier, of how do we, under this white ribbon umbrella. So the white ribbon is a men's engagement response to, for too often, women have been leading conversations about gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And this group of men got together, starting in Canada, and now it's an international movement. We have a local chapter here. This group meets once a month and they talk about some hard conversations. And if anyone knows someone who might be interested in joining those conversations, it is through the roundtable. I have the distinct honor of supporting them as a domestic violence expert. Please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be sent out, but I'd be happy to connect you with that organization.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lauren. Well said. Julie, it sounds like did you have your hand raised? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly to kind of to go with what Lauren and Jeff said, and I will attest, Jeff's the One Love video stuff is not cringy. Is that what you said? We use your stuff all the time. So thank you for making that, thank you for putting that out into the universe for all of us. But I also just want to encourage all of you who are out there, if you're moved by this conversation or want to carry the message. Part of our job, all of us who do prevention work, is to create ambassadors and to create people who carry this message out into the community. So you are staring at a whole bunch of people who would be happy to bring a program to your living room, to your faith community, to your business, to your PTO, to your social group, wherever. And so I want to encourage you to, if you feel like you want to share this information, because a lot of what we do, as Lauren said, while we're drinking up that coffee, is just the basic work about how abuse is about control, not violence. And here's what it looks like. And here's how to support somebody. And so if you are able to bring us in to have that conversation with your community, we are here for you. And we are sitting by the phone waiting for your call or your email. So please think about organizing a program. We're happy to bring content, but we need you to bring the audience.
Julie, well said, really well said. And I think that, hopefully people who are listening tonight as well are now in better position themselves as a result of the information they've just received to themselves be able to help support and prevent and get the kind of resources and things that are necessary to, in this area. I realize we're going up against 8 o'clock. We probably have time for one more question. There aren't any more in the chat. So I can throw one out there, or if there is anything that anyone who is on this panel feels like they wanted to be asked tonight or haven't had a chance to say, but feel like it was important to this conversation, please throw anything out there. We have another minute. And then as was mentioned numerous times, we're going to be sending all these resources as well as other resources out after this sometime this week, actually, in addition to the contact information of all our speakers and some handouts. So you'll also be getting all of this information later on. But is there anything anyone else wanted to say in the last minute or so? Lauren, go ahead.
The one thing I just wanted to mention, I'm not sure that can you hear me?
Yes.
Now you can, great. Almost got through without a Zoom glitch. The one thing I wanted to mention before we signed off, if you are concerned about someone in your life, I know we talked about folks who are supporting people for 20 years, that takes a toll on us as people who care about those folks. And just wanting to remind folks that that's real and that's valid, that you are experiencing trauma and hardship there as well, and encouraging you to get support for yourself. You can also call programs like ours and debrief what that impact is like, reaching out to your friends, your family members, to therapists, to wonderful people who are there, but just acknowledging that while we ask you to do some of that hard work and partnership, we also recognize that that's a big ask, and it's hard to watch someone be suffering and to be able to continue to be there and showing up. And while we thank you for all that you're doing, we just want to recognize that toll and remind you that we are here for you too.
Thank you, Lauren. That sounds like actually like a perfect way to end. Really appreciate that. This has been incredibly informative and helpful. And I want to again thank our panelists and our speakers and Newton-Wellesley and Josephine for all the work that you did on this. And I want to thank everyone who showed up tonight. Being able to recognize unhealthy relationships and to find support is really, really critical. You've seen the statistics, they're very sobering. Everyone knows someone who is in an unhealthy relationship, whether we're aware of it or not. So again, I really want to thank you all, and please do take Julie and all of us up on the offer to reach out, to get help, to get support. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it, and we'll be in touch. Good night.